creeps! Andy here, and today I wanted to provide a list of 50 horror movies that began as horror books. So I've done movie verse books forever on my channel. They're one of my favorite videos to do. Just seeing where something that I love started from. And I will leave an entire playlist down below of every movie verse book that I've done in case you guys are interested in seeing the comparisons, the similarities and differences between these movies and books. So I was hoping that this video might be helpful for some people. I'm sure that you have heard of some of these, maybe a lot of these, but I'm hoping that I can surprise you with a few. And maybe you can add some books to your TBR list because of this video. So hopefully this video is helpful in some way. I just thought it might be an interesting video to make. This is by no means a comprehensive list. There are so many other books out there that inspired movies, and in fact I can do a part 2, I can do a science fiction one, I could do a thriller one, I could do a comedy one. There are so many books that we can talk about, but for today I have just selected 50. A lot of them are more famous movies that I'm sure that you have heard of most of these. And last thing, there are no Stephen Kings because he would take up the whole list, and so I was like, I can't just add one or two. Wouldn't make sense. I could do a whole separate video on Stephen King if you're interested. Otherwise, yeah, these are the non-Stephen King horror books that inspired movies. So let's just get started. I am gonna move over so I can pop up the movie posters here. I'll hold up the book if I have it, and if I don't, I'll pop up a picture. Some of these are novellas, some of these are short stories, so sometimes there won't be a picture to pop up. But let's just get started. I'm very excited. And I'm not gonna give it a whole lot of information about these comparisons because, like I said, we're going through 50 of them. So I'm just rapid fire showing you where they came from. The first one is The Thing. This came from this book right here. It's actually a novella, Who Goes There by John Campbell. Fantastic book. The next one we have is Suspiria. This is an Italian horror film, and it came from this book right here. There is no way that I could pronounce this correctly, so I will just let you figure out the pronunciation. It was loosely based on this. I haven't read this yet, but a movie verse book is coming, so keep an eye out for that. The next one is, of course, Hellraiser. That came from The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker. Wonderful, wonderful read. Another novella. The next one here is RE-ANIMATOR. This came from Herbert West RE-ANIMATOR, and that is from an H.P. Lovecraft. I don't know if it's a novella or a short story. It was originally serialized, so it was published in several different dates of magazines, but an interesting read nonetheless. I wish I could go into detail for all of these, but that's okay. The next one, My Best Friend's Exorcism. This was, probably most of you know the book, but this was recently turned into a horror film. This is by Grady Hendrix. The next one we have here is The Ring. This is the American version. It was inspired from the Japanese version Ringu, which was inspired from this book, which is called Rings now, but I think it was originally published as Ringu by Koji Suzuki. And I have an entire video on how freaking strange this book is, so I'll leave that linked down below. That book is a ride. The next one that I have is Silence of the Lambs, inspired by the book of the same name by Thomas Harris. Next up we have Jaws. That is inspired from Jaws by Peter Benchley. And keeping in the water theme, we have Megalodon. That was inspired by this book called Meg by Steve Alton. There are a million of these books, and they're coming out with the second one, I believe this summer, pretty soon, so I should probably read the second one. Next up, we have Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. I guess I should have done this one first because this is the first movie that came out. This is obviously the movie Red Dragon, but it was also... Red Dragon is even a remake too. Hold on. Manhunter. Yes. So this was made into a movie twice. The first one was called Manhunter. So this was published in 81. Manhunter came out in 86. And then they remade it as Red Dragon. Next on the list, I Know What You Did Last Summer. This is a book by Lewis Duncan. Very different from the movie. It's in fact not a horror book at all. The next one we have is The Exorcist, which of course came from The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. Next up we have I Am Legend. This is actually a remake as well. It came from a movie called Last Man on Earth, I believe. And that was also a movie version of the book I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. The Last Man on Earth is a lot closer to this. It's actually a vampire book, and I Am Legend is obviously quite different. Next up, Audition. This is a Japanese horror movie, and this is inspired by the Japanese book Audition by Ryu Murakami. Let me know if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Very, very mild and doesn't really ramp up until the end. The movie, if you've seen it, is quite disturbing. Next up, we have Psycho, and this, of course, is from Psycho by Robert Bloch. Next, we have A Clockwork Orange, and that is, of course, the book by the same name by Anthony Burgess. Very difficult, challenging book to read. The next one we have is Rosemary's Baby, and that is by the book of the same name, Rosemary's Baby by Ear 11. Is it Ear 11? I cannot pronounce any of these names correctly. And the next one in our Thomas Harris series is Hannibal, and here is the book Hannibal. I gotta be honest with you, one of my least favorite movie verse books that I've done. Very different than the movie, I'll say that. The next one is Bird Box. This movie just came out maybe a few years ago, and that is from this book right here by Josh Mellerman, and it is called Bird Box as well. Next up, we have A Stir of Echoes. This again is by Richard Matheson. Again, very different from the film, but worth a read and checking out where it came from. Next up, The Invisible Man. The book that inspired this is, of course, from H.G. Wells. It's just called The Invisible Man. It's a novella, and it's closest, I think, to this Invisible Man movie, but there are so many other movies, including the most recent Invisible Man movie, that credits H.G. Wells as at least an inspiration behind the idea of the film. Next, Let the Right One In. This is by the book of the same name by Josh Lindquist. I am probably pronouncing that incorrectly. My apologies. Next up, we have one that I'm sure everybody knows, Dracula, and this is, of course, by Bram Stoker. This, again, is a book that has inspired a million bajillion different films, and also keep an eye out if you guys are interested in vampire stuff for a video, an upcoming video. Next up, another one that everybody's heard of, Frankenstein. This again is a book that has inspired so many movies, and this is, of course, by Mary Shelley. Very, very different from the film. So if you guys want to see where Frankenstein's monster started and how he's very different from the movies, absolutely check that out. Next up, The Ruins. We have The Ruins by Scott Smith. Next we have Knock at the Cabin? Knock at the Cabin? It's a stupid name, I'm sorry. That, of course, was inspired by The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay. This name makes so much more sense. Still not sure why it was changed, but that's okay. Next up, we have American Psycho, which, of course, was inspired by this brilliant masterpiece of a book right here, American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, one of my favorite horror books of all time. Next up, we have the movie Old, another M. Night, and that was inspired by this graphic novel right here called Sandcastle. Another one, World War Z, and the book is titled the same, but let me tell you, very different. This is by Max Brooks, and they are, I don't even know how the movie was inspired by that book. It was very, very different. But anyways, next up we have Books of Blood, and that was inspired by this right here, Books of Blood, but this was also an inspiration for other movies too, which we'll get to in a little bit. The next one, The Woman in Black. This was actually made into two separate movies, if I'm not mistaken. I didn't write them down, but I'm pretty sure there were multiple movies made about this book. But this is The Woman in Black by Susan Hill. This is the book that inspired that. Next, we have Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. That is from this child's book right here, and it's actually collected from folklore. So they're not exactly stories that were written by the authors, but they're just like pieces of folklore that were collected and compiled and put into this book. That's creepy and fun for kids. The next one we have is The Birds. This, of course, is a very famous Alfred Hitchcock movie, and that came from a short story by Daphne du Maurier called, you guessed it, The Birds. Next up, we have Cabal. This is another Clive Barker. I believe the movie was written and directed by him. And that came from this little guy right here, Cabal, by, oh, you know what? It's not called Cabal. It's called Nightbreed. Sorry for the confusion. Next up, The Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So this, I mean, inspired so many different movies, TV shows. But this is by Robert Louis Stevenson. And this is just, I can't remember if it's a short story or a novella, but it's pretty small. It's like 75-ish pages. Next up, Burnt Offerings. That is from this book right here, Burnt Offerings by Robert Morosco. Next up, The Bad Seed. This movie came from this book by William March entitled The Bad Seed. Next we have The Haunting, but there are also so many different movies and TV shows that inspired this. Most recently, it inspired The Haunting of Hill House that was on Netflix. Loosely inspired by this book, but this is Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and I mean, there are so many movies and TV shows that came from there. Next up, this might actually be in this book's blood. Whoa. My books almost killed me. Next up, we have the movie Candyman, which came from the short story The Forbidden in one of Clive Barker's books of blood. And we also have Midnight Meat Train, which is from, again, another short story in his Books of Blood series. That one's just called Midnight Meat Train, I think. The Midnight Meat Train. Next up, we have Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This was made twice for film, and it's from the book. Here's the confusing part though. Some of the books call it The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and some books, the title just says The Body Snatchers. So I'm not sure which one's correct, but this is from Jack Finney, and this was published in 1955, which is kind of crazy. Next up, we have Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. This again was a movie that was made into film twice, in 1962 and in 1991. I think I've only seen the 60s version of this, but this is from a book with the same name by Henry Farrell, and this was published in 1960. Next, we have The Stepford Wives. This is another Year 11 book. This one caught me by surprise. This is 30 Days of Night, and this actually came from a 3-issue comic series that was published in 2002. It was written by Steve Niles and illustrated by Ben Templesmith. The next is The Fly. This one also surprised me. This came from a short story by the same name by George Langlin, and this was published in 1957 in a Playboy magazine. Next up, we have The Howling. This is an 81 horror film, and this is a novel by Gary Brandner by the same name that was published in 77. The Exorcist 3 actually came from the book Legion by William Peter Blatty, who wrote the original Exorcist book. Next up, we have The Amityville Horror. This is a movie that was created in 79, and then countless other movies were made after it. All of them coming from the supposed true story that is in the Amity Horror book by Jay Anson about the Lutz family. Last up here, we have The Black Phone. That is from a short story that came from this Joe Hill book. It was originally published as 20th Century Ghosts, so if you have that book, then you have this short story. And then I think that's 50, but just in case I messed up somewhere and miscounted, I'll give you an extra one. There's also the movie The Ritual, which recently came out, I think in the last, like, I don't know, 5 or so years. And that is from a book by the name The Ritual by Adam Neville. So that is it. That is 50 horror movies that were inspired from these 50 horror books. Let me know if any of these surprised you, or if there are any of these that you feel like you have to run out and buy right now, which ones you've read, which one you're interested in. Let me know if you guys want this in a sci-fi version or a thriller version or anything else. I hope this video helped you in some way, and I will see you soon with another horror video. Thanks for watching. Bye!